El Salvador, once one of the most dangerous countries in the world, has been the stage for an intense and controversial crackdown on criminal gangs under the leadership of President Nayib Bukele. Since coming into office in 2019, Bukele has declared a war on gangs and has implemented drastic measures to rid of the notorious M13 and Barrio 18 gangs that have terrorized communities for years. His administration's aggressive tactics have led to the imprisonment of over 1.6% of El Salvador's population, making it one of the most extensive mass incarceration efforts in recent history. But while the streets of El Salvador may be quieter and safer for some, the true cost of Bukele's war on gangs remains the subject of heated debate both inside the country and internationally. With Bukele's potential re-election on the horizon, there is speculation that these numbers could surge even higher, raising questions about the long-term social, political, and economic impacts of such a sweeping campaign. Is El Salvador's approach truly sustainable, or does it come at a price too steep for the nation to bear? Nayib Bukele's rise to power. Nayib Bukele's presidency represents a break from traditional Salvadoran politics. A young, charismatic leader, Bukele gained popularity by positioning himself as an anti-establishment figure determined to dismantle the political elites and curb corruption. Running on a platform of change, Bukele presented himself as the only leader capable of solving El Salvador's long-standing issues of gang violence, poverty, and government inefficiency. Upon taking office, Bukele quickly moved to assert his power and demonstrate that he was serious about tackling gang violence. His administration launched a state of emergency in March 2022 after a weekend of violence that saw dozens of homicides across the country. This marked the beginning of a zero-tolerance policy against gangs, where the government arrested tens of thousands of alleged gang members in sweeping crackdowns. Bukele's rise to power was largely fueled by public frustration with previous administrations that had failed to effectively deal with the gang problem. For decades, the M13 and Barrio 18 gangs had exerted control over large portions of the country, extorting businesses, engaging in drug trafficking, and committing brutal acts of violence. Bukele's promise of a safer El Salvador resonated with many Salvadorans who were desperate, even if it meant supporting authoritarian measures. The war on gangs. Bukele's war on gangs has been marked by mass arrests, military-style operations, and an overwhelming show of force by the Salvadoran government. His administration claims to have made significant progress in dismantling gang structures, arresting over 70,000 suspected gang members, and incarcerating many without trial. Bukele himself often takes to social media to showcase the success of his policies, posting images of handcuffed gang members in overcrowded prisons and touting declining homicide rates as evidence of his victory over crime. 1. Mass incarceration and human rights concerns. One of the most controversial aspects of Bukele's approach is the sheer scale of the mass incarceration effort. According to estimates, roughly 1.6% of the country's population has been imprisoned as part of the government's crackdown on gangs. This is a staggering figure, especially considering El Salvador's total population of around 6.5 million people. While Bukele's administration claims that the mass arrests have effectively reduced gang violence, human rights organizations have raised serious concerns about the tactics being used. Reports of arbitrary arrests, lack of due process, and overcrowded prisons have sparked outrage among international observers. Families of those detained claim that many innocent people have been swept up in the government's crackdown, with little to no evidence linking them to gang activity. In many cases, suspects have been held for months without formal charges or legal representation, leading to accusations that Bukele's government is violating basic human rights. Moreover, El Salvador's prisons, notorious for their brutal conditions even before Bukele's crackdown, have become dangerously overcrowded. The government has constructed massive prison complexes, such as the new Terrorism Confinement Center, to house the influx of inmates, but these facilities are still struggling to keep up with the sheer number of detainees. Detainees are often crammed into small cells, with reports of insufficient food, water, and medical care. Human rights groups have warned that the inhumane conditions in these prisons could lead to long-term psychological and physical damage for those incarcerated. 2. Declining homicide rates and public support. Despite the human rights concerns, Bukele's tough stance on gangs has garnered widespread public support. For many Salvadorans, the reduction in homicides and violent crime is proof that the president's strategy is working. El Salvador, once one of the deadliest countries in the world with homicide rates as high as 100 per 100,000 people, has seen a significant drop in murders since Bukele took office. In 2022, the country recorded one of its lowest homicide rates in decades, with just 496 murders reported, compared to over 6,000 a decade earlier. The improved security situation has been particularly noticeable in areas that were previously under the control of gangs. For years, Salvadorans lived in fear of extortion, kidnappings, and violence perpetrated by criminal groups. Now, many report feeling safer in their neighborhoods, and businesses are beginning to reopen in areas that were once considered no-go zones. This newfound sense of security has solidified Bukele's popularity, with his approval ratings consistently hovering around 90%. For supporters of Bukele, the ends justify the means. They argue that in a country as plagued by gang violence as El Salvador, drastic measures are necessary to restore order. However, critics warn that the short-term gains in security may come at a long-term cost. The cost of the crackdown. While Bukele's war on gangs has led to a reduction in violent crime, the social, political, and economic costs of his approach are becoming increasingly apparent. Erosion of democracy, or one of the most significant concerns raised by Bukele's critics, is the erosion of democratic norms in El Salvador. Bukele has repeatedly clashed with the judiciary, the media, and other branches of government, raising fears that he is consolidating power in a way that undermines democratic institutions. In February 2021, Bukele's party won a supermajority in the Legislative Assembly, allowing him to replace judges on the Constitutional Court and the Attorney General's office with loyalists. This move has been widely criticized as an attack on the independence of the judiciary, with some warning that it sets a dangerous precedent for authoritarian rule. Bukele has also used his control of the legislative branch to push through laws that give the government broad powers to detain suspects without trial, further eroding the rule of law in the country. Bukele's attacks on the press have also raised alarms about the state of democracy in El Salvador. El Salvador. Journalists who criticize the president or report on the human rights abuses associated with his anti-gang policies have faced harassment, threats, and intimidation. And Bukele frequently uses social media to discredit critical journalists, referring to them as mercenaries or opposition mouthpieces. This hostile environment has made it increasingly difficult for independent media to operate freely in El Salvador. 2. Economic implications. The economic cost of Bukele's war on gangs is another area of concern. While the government has poured resources into building new prisons and funding security operations, critics argue that this focus on militarization is diverting attention away from other pressing economic issues. El Salvador remains one of the poorest countries in Latin America, with high levels of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. Bukele's administration has also made headlines for its controversial decision to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender in 2021, a move that has been met with skepticism from economists and international financial institutions. The Bitcoin experiment has been volatile, with the cryptocurrency's value fluctuating wildly, raising questions about its long-term viability as a tool for economic development. Additionally, Bukele's focus on security has not addressed the root causes of gang violence in El Salvador. Poverty, lack of education, and limited job opportunities are some of the underlying factors that drive young people into gang life. Without addressing these structural issues, some experts warn that the gang problem may resurface once the immediate crackdown ends. 3. Social impact. The mass incarceration of thousands of young men has also had a profound social impact on Salvadoran communities. With so many men behind bars, families are being torn apart, and entire neighborhoods are being left without a stable male presence. Many of those arrested were the primary breadwinners for their families, leaving wives, children, and elderly parents to fend for themselves in an already struggling economy. The crackdown has also led to a climate of fear and distrust, as Salvadorans are wary of being falsely accused of gang involvement. The arbitrary nature of some arrests has created a sense of insecurity, with people afraid to leave their homes or speak out against the government for fear of retaliation. This has led to a chilling effect on free speech and civil liberties, further contributing to the erosion of democracy in the country. International reactions. Bukele's war on gangs has drawn international attention, with some praising his bold approach to reducing crime and others condemning the human rights abuses associated with his policies. The United States, a key ally of El Salvador, has taken a cautious stance. While U.S. officials have acknowledged the reduction in homicides, they have also expressed concern over the erosion of democratic norms and the mass incarceration of suspects without due process. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have been more vocal in their criticism, calling on Bukele to respect the rule of law and protect the rights of detainees.